Hello everyone and welcome to this chess openings video entitled How to Play Any Chess Opening. So I had some requests from viewers to do some opening videos. So in the future I will do specific openings, do videos on specific openings. But today I wanted to do this video on how to play any chess opening to try and help beginners, even more advanced, more experienced players. It can be a review, but in this video, I wanted to explain how you can play against openings that you're not familiar with if you just follow basic opening principles. So some beginners think that maybe they want to memorize a bunch of openings and moves, but they would probably be better off spending their time on studying tactics and end games and strategy, and maybe not so much trying to memorize opening moves and different openings. So what I would recommend is to learn these basic principles, which I will show you here for the openings. And let's begin here. So if we take a look at the most common opening moves here in this database. So the most common opening moves are e4 and d4. And if you ask why is that, why are those moves played most often? Well, because they're generally considered two of the best moves. And the reason is that in the opening, you want to try and control the center. And you want to do that not only in the opening, but throughout most, if not all, of the game. And to do that, an easy way is to push your pawns forward in the center. And also by pushing your pawns forward, it gives room for pieces behind them to develop. So let's look at the two most common moves, e4 and d4. Well, a beginner might ask, what's the difference? Well, with e4, when you play that, it's usually more of a tactical game because the pawns are usually traded off in the center and the pieces have more room to develop and attack. So e4 leads to more tactical, attacking games, which a beginner should probably start out with e4. That way they can practice tactics and learn tactics and get better at tactics, because most beginners lose games due to an overlooked tactic. So e4 is the most common move. And then what is the most common move played against it? Well, we see that actually in this database, c5 is played most often. And the second move is e5. So most beginners would probably respond with e5 against e4 and keep the game even. Now c5 is also a good move because c5 counterattacks and attacks this d4 square. So if a good principle is to push forward a central pawn, usually your E or D pawn, maybe the C pawn as well. But if your opponent lets you put both of the pawns, the D and the E pawn, both in the center, that's generally a great idea to do that because it controls a lot of squares. And remember, when you're trying to control squares on the board, you generally do not control the squares you land on, but so this pawn is on e4. It's not really controlling e4, but it's attacking d5 and f5. But particularly this important central pawn, or excuse me, central square on d4 that can try and slow down or prevent black from pushing his d pawn forward. So if we take a look, I'll look at e5, because c5 is a little more complicated. So most beginners would start off with e5, and I'd probably recommend that if you're starting out. because it's less complicated to play. C5 can become very complicated, the Sicilian defense. But if we look at e4, e5, and now the next most common moves. So by far, knight to f3 is the most played move. And why is that played the most? Because it's one of the best moves. Generally, in the opening, you want to develop your knights quickly because they're slower than the bishops, the queen, and the rooks, because all of those pieces, queen, bishop, and rook, can move across the whole board in one move as long as something isn't blocking them. But knights, it takes them longer to move across the board. So generally you want to develop them first. And knight to f3 is probably the best move here. And that's why it's played the most often, because it develops a piece. Another principle in the opening is to try and develop your pieces as fast as you can, and try not to move them more than once unless you have to, unless you're recapturing a piece of yours that was captured. But generally, you want to get all your pieces developed off of the back rank as fast as possible. So knight to f3 is played here. It develops a piece off the back rank. And if you have a choice of moving it to h3 or f3 or e2, usually f3 is going to be the best move, because if you go to h3, there's an old saying, a knight on the rim is dim. So if you put the knight on the side of the board, it has less squares that it can move to and attack. So as an example, this knight here is attacking, e5, d4, d2, then the e and g squares, h2. It just covers a total of 8 different squares, whereas if it was on the side of the board, it's limiting the amount of squares that it covers. From h3, it can only cover g5, f4, and then of course f2 and g1. So it kind of cuts the power of that knight in half. So this move, knight to f3, develops a piece. It also attacks the pawn in the center, forcing black to make a decision on what to do about that. And so another good general opening principle is to make moves that accomplish more than one thing. So this gets a piece off the back row, so it develops a piece. It covers the central squares, these two important squares of d4 and e5, and it attacks a valuable pawn in the center of blacks. And another thing that it does is to quickly get a piece off the back rank that's in between the king and the rook. So in all openings, another goal is to get your king quickly to safety. And whether that means castling kingside or queenside, or if the center is completely blocked, it could mean keeping your king in the center, but more often it is safer, especially for beginners, to castle quickly. And kingside castling is the quickest, as there's only a knight and a bishop to move out of the way, and then you're ready to castle. Okay, moving on. Now, if we look at black's best response and most often played responses, knight to c6 is played most often, and second is knight to f6. So what is the difference between those two? Well, knight to c6 develops a piece, attacks the center, and covers this e5 pawn. But knight to f6, so that copies white, but it leaves this pawn undefended and gives white the opportunity to capture that pawn. So knight f6 is not bad, but it allows white to have more options by being able to immediately attack this pawn if he decides to do that. Whereas knight to c6, the most played move, basically holds the game. It develops a piece to a good square towards the center, covers the center and guards this pawn, and it just kind of forces white to decide what he will do next. So now, if we continue on and look at the best opening moves here, we see that bishop to b5 and bishop to c4 are the best opening moves, the ones played most often. So bishop to b5, that is the Ruy Lopez opening, and it basically develops the bishop to b5. It allows white the chance to castle kingside after that bishop is moved, but it puts more pressure on this knight, which is guarding the center. So even though the bishop does not attack the center directly, it indirectly affects the center by attacking this knight, which is helping to control squares in the center and guard this pawn. But as a beginner, I probably wouldn't recommend starting with the Ruy Lopez because it can be a more complicated game to play, especially if you're a beginner, even an intermediate player. Of course, feel free to experiment with that opening and try different openings, but probably bishop to c4 or d4, or even knight to c3 would be easier moves to play, especially if you're starting out and learning different openings. But let's say, we can take a look at a few of these. Bishop to c4, that also allows you to get ready to castle here, but this attacks a vulnerable f pawn here. And if we look at most of the pawns, they're protected by multiple pieces. So this d pawn is protected by the king, the queen, the bishop, but this f pawn, it is not only protected by only one piece, but that piece is the king. So that can cause problems, especially when multiple pieces pile up. If this knight were able to move here without the queen being able to capture it, then you would have the bishop and the knight lining up on this f pawn and threatening either a capture with check on the king, or if the knight were able to jump in there and were protected by the bishop, well, then you'd have a fork on the rook or the queen, on the rook and the queen, and the knight could potentially capture the rook after the queen would probably move. All right. So bishop to c4 is a highly recommended move. It's a little bit easier to play than bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez opening. But if we go back and take a look at another move, instead of bishop to b5 or bishop to c4, the next most played move is d4. So this follows the principle of pushing your central pawns forward, although here black can capture that pawn. So generally it's a good idea to put one or both of your central pawns out 2 squares, and generally it's better to push these central pawns 2 squares instead of 1, because as an example, if this pawn would have only moved to d3, well, then that would block in this bishop and kind of slow down black's coordination. The bishop could still go to e2, but that would be a lot more passive, and the bishop wouldn't be doing as much there. Whereas if it goes here to c4 or b5, it can attack. If this move were played, generally when you have your opponent has both of their central pawns moved forward here, you want to knock one of them out. So of course the most often played move is e takes d4. So, we could take a quick look at that. Capture. Well, then, to keep the game even, white would be forced to recapture. White could play a gambit, which is when you give up a pawn to gain something in return, usually faster development. So white could ignore this and develop the bishop here and be ready to castle, or white could just capture immediately. And usually you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening, but here that's excusable because you were recapturing a piece that was captured. So black already moved a pawn twice in the opening, so you moving a knight twice in the opening, the game is still pretty even. And now the most often played moves are either knight to f6 or bishop to c5. So both sides just continue to develop. So I'm going to go back to the beginning here and start over. Let's say after e4, we'll play some different openings, and I'll give you an idea of how you can play against any opening. So when you're trying to learn openings, the first thing to do is to decide what you want to play first, of course. So if you're a beginner, I would recommend e4 because it helps you develop faster. The game usually opens up more in the center, giving your pieces more room to maneuver, and there'll be more tactics, which will allow you to experience more tactics, play more tactics, defend against more tactics, and just improve your tactics overall, which will definitely help you improve at chess faster. All right, so after e4, if the opponent is a beginner, they'll usually play e5. We can look at some other variations after this. And then knight to f3 we've seen is one of the best moves, probably the best move to play because it attacks immediately and it gets ready to castle on the king side. And so if knight to c6 is played, well then there are some other options to be played here. So I'll just play this for example, knight to c3, and then if black just responded with the most often played move, knight to f6, well then this bishop to b5 is the most played move, followed by bishop to b4, and then castling by white, castling by black. And so if we look at these moves and what has developed or what has occurred so far, we notice that both sides, even though they've copied each other, they've moved their knights out early before the bishops to develop these slower knights, and they've moved them towards the center that helps control these important squares. Then they've started to develop their bishops, and they push the bishops on the king side first to allow them to castle quickly. So now their kings are safer here where they have castled. And some beginners may ask, well, why is it safer to castle? Aren't you trapped in the corner? Well, think of it more like putting your king inside a barricade. He's kind of barricaded in here, or in a bunker. He has more defenses, a wall of pawns in front of him, a knight helping him, helping defend him. And something that's very important is the king can only be attacked from head on or from the side here. Nothing can come in from the other side of the board because that's the edge of the board. Whereas if you leave the king in the middle, he can be attacked from the center and from the left or the right. So 3 different angles of attack if the king is left in the center, and only 2 angles of attack if you castle. So that basically cuts your opponent's attacking possibilities down by 1/3. So I highly recommend that you castle and castle early in a game, especially if you're a beginner. Now, once you're more experienced, you'll know when to hold back from castling or castle queenside. So, moving on, it looks like from here the most played move is d3, which just fortifies this pawn here, which, if this bishop captured, then that pawn would be undefended and could be captured. So a central pawn is moved, helping fortify the center. Here, it only moved one square, but that's not as bad now because you're defending a pawn in the center, and this bishop has already moved outside of this pawn chain. So that's another thing to watch out for in the opening is look for moves that put your pieces on squares where they're not as restricted. So you don't want to put your pieces behind your pawns. Knights are okay because they can jump over them, but you don't want to block your bishops in. You see how the queen, the rooks are blocked in right now. So in the opening, you want to develop your central pawns. Two pawns side by side if your opponent lets them, and jump out two squares forward. Then you want to develop your knights first, then your bishops. Then move your queen up, but not too far where it can be attacked and harassed. Usually only on the second or third rank is a good place to put your queen. And then once these pieces are moved out of the way, the rooks will be connected. And they work better when they're connected and supporting each other, as they can both fortify one another. And it gives your rooks more room to move. And you generally want to put your rooks in behind pawns of yours that have moved forward. Or if pawns have been exchanged, you want to put your rooks on half open ranks or completely open ranks. Ranks or files. All right, so let's continue on. Now, d6 is the most played move, fortifying the center and letting the bishop out. And now it looks like bishop to g5 is played most often. And then here the most often played move is to just capture this pawn here. And it looks like bishop to g4 could be played, so they could copy each other for quite a while, but black cannot copy white indefinitely because if there was a mating threat, then white of course would mate black one move before black would be able to mate him if they tried to copy down to a mating end. So now it looks like knight to d5 is played most often. So we could take a look at that. But, if we followed the theme that we looked at earlier, maybe we would move the queen up or move the rook to this file where the pawn has been pushed forward already. But let's take a look here at what is possible. We'll go with the most played moves, which are knight to d5. Now, why has white moved a piece twice in the opening? Generally, you don't want to do that. But he is attacking a knight, which is pinned here. So, he has some kind of plan. But if you're a beginner and you're not sure what to do, something that may be okay is to just continue developing. So maybe moving the queen, and then if they move the queen, well, then you can move your rooks here in behind the pawns that have been pushed forward. So you could try something like this. That way all your pieces are developed. And sometimes, in general, another good strategy is to hold back an attack until you've developed all your pieces, and especially your queen side rook, which is usually one of the last pieces to be developed. So here both sides have developed everything, and now they could start attacking and going crazy if they wanted to. But already I could see a problem that I'm sure there were better moves, but I just wanted to show how you could develop everything quickly. Now, we probably overlooked some things. Like right now, white has a chance to attack the queen here. And then this knight cannot recapture, or the bishop would capture the queen. So there's always tactics involved, no matter what you decide to play. So I'll go back now to the very beginning. Let's see here. So if we take a look at this from the beginning again, how to play any opening. Well, the rules to follow are: develop one or both of your pawns in the center, whether that's e4 and d4 or d4 and c4. That's usually, all those moves are usually good, but I would probably not recommend f4 until you become more experienced, because that could lead to attacks here on this f2 square, or attacks on this diagonal leading to your king. So let's say your opponent plays something different, like the number one move, c5. Well, now what do? Well, you just follow the basic opening rules and principles. So develop pawns in the center, develop your knights towards the center, then try and develop your bishops, get your king castled to safety, then develop your queen, usually only to the second or third rank, and then develop your rooks towards the center on open files or half open files, or if they're all closed, you could even put them behind pawns that you plan to push forward. All right, so here you think, well, should I play this pawn to d4? You could play that, but we see that that is the fourth most played move, and it's not played as often because it's a little trickier. If you play d4, this less valuable side pawn can capture your more valuable central pawn, and then you have to make a decision. Do you capture with the queen immediately to keep material even? But then knight to c6 could be played attacking the queen. So that's why we see here that knight to f3 and knight to c3 are played way more often. So once again, knight to f3 is played the most because it helps control the center, and now it allows you to push this pawn, and if the pawn is captured, well, then the knight can jump in there towards the center even more. So now the number one played move is for a pawn push here to d6, and the second move is to develop one of the knights. So if we look at this pawn move here, well then now d4 is played most often. Now also bishop to b5 can be played to check the king, but we'll just stick with this move. If this is played and there's a capture, well then the most often played move is to capture with the knight. And now another knight here, well, black's first knight is developed attacking. So that is something that you want to try and do, is make a move that does more than one thing. So you develop the knight, you control the center. By developing that knight, it gets you closer to possibly castling on the king side, but you're also attacking an unprotected pawn, which forces white to decide what to do here. And the best move, or one of the best moves, is to just develop a knight, controlling the center and protecting this pawn. And then the game continues here, usually with a6. So you might ask, well, that move, what did it do? It didn't really follow the opening principles of pushing your pawns in the center, developing pieces, getting your king castled. But this was a defensive move, and that's why I was saying the Sicilian defense is a little more complicated. So if you're a beginner, I probably would not recommend starting that out as a beginner if you're playing it from the black side. Now you might have to face it as white. So what this move does is keep pieces out of b5 here. It basically limits white's options. The knights can't jump in there. The bishop can't move here with check. So now the most common moves are bishop moves next, as white has already developed the knights, and it looks like bishop to g5 is played most often. And here we have e6 being the number one move. Now, why is e5 not played? Well, that would leave a weak backward pawn here on d6. So if the pawns stay side by side, that gives the option for this pawn on d6 to eventually push forward. So the game continues with white's most played move being f4, developing a pawn that helps control this valuable e5 square. Now, another thing about the Sicilian being complicated, I usually don't recommend beginners to push this f pawn, but here things are blocked and the queen or a bishop is not able to come in here and deliver a check. Other moves that can be played are queen moves, or maybe even this bishop moving. But we'll look at the main move since it's played most often. Bishop to e7 is the most common response because there's a threat here of pushing forward. If this pawn captures and this recaptures, the knight would be pinned by this bishop to the queen. So bishop to e7 does multiple things. It develops a piece, it readies black to castle kingside, and it breaks this pin. And then, after bishop to e7, it looks like queen to f3 is the most common move. So this develops a piece. It helps control the center. It could even keep this knight from jumping forward here because the queen could just capture it. So now we have the most common move by black is also developing the queen, which puts the queen on this half open file. It lets the queen aim down through the center here and just apply more pressure. And, I went backwards. Okay, and then now white just continues to complete development. The number one move is for white to castle queenside, so the king is castled to a safer area towards the edge of the board, but castling queenside has allowed this rook to land on the half open d file, putting pressure up the center here. And now it looks like knight at b to d7 is the most common continuation. And next we have g4. And I won't go too much further, but we see white still has to develop the bishop and the queen, the kingside rook. And black has to decide whether to castle and develop this rook towards the center, and also develop this rook and bishop. So I hope that gives you an idea of how a random opening here the Sicilian defense is played and how the pieces are positioned. So let's go back to the beginning here. Let's see. Okay. You may have asked, well, what about if the opponent plays, or excuse me, what if I should play d4 instead of e4? Well, that's possible. In the beginning, I would recommend e4 to help you better learn tactics. And then in the future, if you want to decide to play d4, those games will be more strategic because the center usually locks up more and there's more maneuvering around the center pieces that are locked, the center pawns. But no matter what you play, just remember you can play any opening if you follow general principles. So I'll play, let's see here, if I figure out how to take back this move, which it is not letting me. All right, why is it not letting me change this? Okay, reset, there we go. Okay, so if we play the second most played move, d4, and whether you are white or black playing this, what do? How do you decide if you don't know anything about openings and you're trying to learn? Let's say you're used to playing e4, e5, and your opponent plays d4, or you decide you want to play d4. Well, if we look at the most common move, it looks like knight to f6 is played, which is a developing move that controls the center squares, gets the knight off the back rank, and it kind of waits to see what white will do next. But an easier way to play maybe is just to go d5 here, which kind of copies white. And so both sides are even here. They're controlling the same amount of space. They both control central squares. And the difference between d4 and e4, one is that the bishop on this side can get out, but the queen is a little bit more restricted. And also, generally, these games are usually locked in the center more. So the most common move is c4. So here white tries to get both pawns out and in the center. And you may ask, well, it looks like I can just capture this. Yes, that is possible, but that could pull your valuable central pawn off to the side. And we see that the most played moves are either c6 or e6. So, either one we could look at. They both protect this central pawn. And then white develops the knight here behind this pawn that he's already pushed. And so, the game may continue with both sides developing. And if white continues to develop, maybe he'll go here to pin this knight to the queen. The bishop is developed to break that pin. Now another central pawn is played to let this bishop out. Black can go ahead and castle already. Both sides just continue to develop. Now here we see that black has developed here and blocked his own bishop, but he's basically covering his other knight here. So if it's captured, then this knight can recapture and move out of the way of the bishop. And sometimes the bishop will, a pawn will be moved and the bishop will develop to b6, or excuse me, b7 or a6. But continuing on, the most played moves from here are the rook moving behind this pawn that has been pushed forward. Then c6, fortifying the center. The bishop moving up here. And then a capture here, which is done because this bishop has moved once, but after you capture, now it's forced to move again. And so, now knight to d5 can be played, and then some pieces are exchanged. So you get the idea. If you're playing an opening that you're unfamiliar with, you can play any opening. I'll just reiterate this. You can play any opening just by learning basic principles. So what to do in any opening. Try and get your central pawns moved out, which helps develop, it gives room for you to develop the pieces behind them. So if you're a beginner especially, I'd recommend starting with e4. Most beginners will respond with e5. And then you develop this knight, which attacks the pawn, controls central squares, gets you closer to castling. So you want to develop your central pawns. Develop your knights quickly because they're slower than your bishops. And by holding back on the bishops, it allows you to wait and see what your opponent is doing and help you decide what the best squares will be for your bishops to move to. It just gives you more time to see where the best place to put your bishops will be. And then you want to get your king castled quickly and get it into safety, because remember, once you castle, your king can only be attacked from 2 directions instead of 3. All right, so we'll continue. Knight to f3, then knight to c6 is usually played. Then you can play the Italian game with bishop to c4. A lot of times they'll just respond by copying, or they could move their knight. Then you can go ahead and castle and your king is safe. Now, if they go ahead and develop their knight, they're ready to castle. And now, you could play it safe by just pushing this pawn 1 and fortifying the center pawn. They could do the same, or they could castle. So let's say they do the same. Well, now you have to decide what to do. There are different options. The most played move is to start pushing forward here with this pawn to help cover the center here. And then, black could go ahead and castle now if they want to. And then white, well, the most common move is just to move this bishop back here, which will prevent this knight from being able to attack it and capture it. Now it can retreat back, and if the knight attacks, the bishop could just slide back here and have an escape hatch. And now the most common move is this, allowing the escape hatch for black's bishop, and then white continues to develop here. So after this retreat, we have maybe h3 to prevent a pin on the knight. And so, maybe the bishop goes here attacking, and white could just ignore that and develop a rook behind the pawn. And so at this point, you're getting into the middle game. You want to start trading pieces, attacking, figuring out what way to go. So something else that'll help you play any opening is I wouldn't try and just memorize a whole bunch of moves, especially when you're starting out. Just pick one opening for white, one for black, stick with it, and slowly try and learn one move deeper into the opening. Let's say if we go back to the beginning and that e4 is what you want to play, and then your opponent usually plays e5. You want to play in these type of moves. So you want to play this. And now you know what to do if they play bishop to c5. You know that you normally want to castle. But let's say if we go back, they don't play bishop to c5. Well, what if they just play this move? Well, here it looks like d4 is one of the best moves to play. You could play c3, or you could just castle like you normally would. So then you just decide one move at a time what you want to play, and you slowly build that up. You could write these moves down, or you could put them in the computer in a little database, or whatever you do to review them and learn them. So you can play any move by doing that, or excuse me, any opening by doing that. So before this video goes too crazy long, I will just review everything. You can play any opening by following opening principles. Basically, push your pawns in the center, develop your knights, then your bishops, castle your king to safety as quickly as you can, and then just continue your development of pieces, and try not to move pieces more than once unless you're recapturing, or you're forced to, because you want to get your pieces out and off the back rank as fast as you can. You want to control the center of the board by attacking it with your pieces and pawns. And I'd recommend not trying to memorize a bunch of moves. Start small and just try and maybe remember one move deeper in the position each game that you play. And hopefully slowly, you'll start to remember more over time. But instead of trying to memorize a bunch of openings and learn too many openings, I would concentrate on studying tactics and the end game and chess strategy, or reviewing master games to see how they play. All right. Well, I'll probably do more on this in the future and more on specific openings. I hope this helped everybody that has problems with openings. And I'll definitely dig more into openings in the future. Thank you, everybody. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Have a good evening.